Picture it before you try to explain it. It is high summer in Bourbon County, Kentucky, and the corn is shoulder high in the fields around a small Presbyterian meeting house called Cane Ridge. For days, wagons have been rattling in from every direction, families who traveled 50, 80, 100 miles, sleeping under their own wagons at night because word has gone out that something is happening here, something nobody quite has language for yet. By the time the crowd peaks, there are somewhere between 10 and 25,000 people camped in a clearing in a territory whose largest town, Lexington, has fewer than 2,000 residents. Nobody in the history of the American frontier has ever seen this many human beings gathered in one place for one purpose. And the purpose is God. Or so everyone would have told you. But watch closely, because what actually happens over the next 6 days looks less like a church service than a kind of mass fever breaking. A woman standing near the front suddenly shrieks and drops to the ground as though she has been shot. She's not hurt. She lies there rigid, then trembling, for an hour, sometimes for a day. Men who have never shed a tear in their lives are sobbing so hard they cannot stand. A farmer's body begins to jerk uncontrollably, his head snapping side to side so violently that observers worry his neck will break. A phenomenon so common at these gatherings that people have already given it a name: the jerks. Elsewhere in the crowd, people are barking, literally barking on all fours at the base of trees in what witnesses solemnly called the barking exercise, convinced they were treeing sin the way a hound trees a raccoon. Others fall into what looks like catatonia, lying motionless for hours, and wake up describing visions of heaven and hell in vivid, specific detail. 7 or more preachers, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, denominations that back east would barely speak to one another, are preaching simultaneously from tree stumps and wagon beds scattered across the grounds, each with his own knot of listeners, so that the whole camp becomes a strange competing chorus of sermons, hymns, screams, and weeping that carries, according to some accounts, for miles. This is Cane Ridge. Historians would later call it the American Pentecost. At the time, plenty of respectable people simply called it insanity. Here is the question worth sitting with before we go any further. Why? Not why did people go to church? People had been going to church in America for 2 centuries by 1801. The question is why the sober, the rational, the literate citizens of a brand new republic, a nation that had just finished building its entire political identity on Enlightenment reason, on Jefferson's cool deism, on Franklin's practical skepticism, would suddenly, in fields and forests across the frontier, start collapsing, shaking, and barking in religious ecstasy. Why would a culture that prized self-control above almost every other virtue produce, again and again across more than a century, explosions of raw, uncontrolled emotion that its own leaders could not explain, could not stop, and, this is the part that matters, could not afford to ignore? That question is the spine of this entire story. Because Cane Ridge was not an isolated freak accident. It was the visible peak of something that had already been building for 70 years and would keep reshaping American life for another 100. Historians call the whole phenomenon in its various eruptions the Great Awakenings, plural because there were at least 3 distinct waves of it, separated by decades, driven by different preachers, aimed at different audiences, and yet unmistakably part of the same current. And what makes the story worth an hour of your time isn't just the strangeness of the barking and the fainting. It's what came out the other side of it, a new kind of religion, a new kind of political imagination, and, whether its preachers intended this or not, a slow-motion argument for the idea that ordinary people, not kings, not bishops, not inherited authority of any kind, got to decide for themselves what they believed and who deserved to lead them. to understand how a field full of screaming Kentuckians in 1801 connects to the American Revolution, to the fight to abolish slavery, to the invention of modern mass evangelism, and even to the Pentecostal and evangelical movements that still shape American politics today, we have to go back. Back past Cane Ridge, past the Revolution, back to a much quieter, much colder moment. A Massachusetts congregation in the 1730s, sitting through sermons so formal and so dry that a young minister named Jonathan Edwards was starting to worry that his entire religion was dying of politeness. In a story like this, one always have to explain why the previous scene mattered and why the next one had to happen. So here is the bridge back 100 years to understand why Cane Ridge's chaos felt to the people living through it like salvation rather than madness. You first have to understand just how asleep colonial religion had become by the early 1700s, and how much was quietly at stake in waking it up. By the first decades of the 18th century, the fire that had driven the original Puritan settlers across an ocean was, by most honest accounts, banked down to embers. The generation that had fled England for religious conviction so intense they were willing to die of scurvy on a wooden ship to practice, it had given way to grandchildren who inherited the pews, the property, and the social respectability of church-going without necessarily inheriting the burning conviction that had built the churches in the first place. In New England, Congregationalist ministers increasingly preached sermons that read more like moral philosophy lectures than calls to conversion, reasoned, measured, comfortable. In the middle colonies in the South, the Anglican establishment was, if anything, even more formal, more tied to social hierarchy, more content with a religion that asked for attendance rather than transformation. This wasn't laziness exactly. It was the Enlightenment doing what the Enlightenment does, elevating reason, order, and moderation, and treating displays of raw religious emotion with the same suspicion a modern doctor might treat an unproven folk remedy. Ministers had been trained to believe that faith should look like understanding, a well-reasoned assent to correct doctrine, not like weeping in the aisles. For the people sitting in the pews, this created a quiet, almost invisible problem. Church had become something you attended, not something that happened to you. And a surprising number of ordinary colonists, especially the young, were drifting away from that kind of religion entirely, not because they'd stopped believing in God, but because nothing about Sunday morning felt urgent anymore. That was the world Jonathan Edwards was born into, and it was the world he became convinced, with a kind of quiet fury, needed to be shaken awake. The stakes, from where he sat, were not small. If people no longer felt the terror and wonder of their own salvation, he believed, they would drift toward eternal damnation while sitting comfortably in church every single Sunday, convinced they were fine. That is the engine that drives almost everything that follows in this story. A conviction shared across generations of very different preachers that comfortable religion is not real religion, and that only fear, ecstasy, or some other overwhelming emotional experience could break through the crust of respectability and reach the soul underneath it. Here is where the story needs to slow down, because this is one of the moments where everything changed in a single afternoon. On July 8, 1741, in the small town of Enfield, Connecticut, Jonathan Edwards, a slight, unimposing man who by every account read his sermons in a flat, unemotional monotone, without gestures, without theatrics, stood up in front of a congregation that had, by local reputation, grown spiritually cold and complacent. He had preached this exact sermon before, in his own pulpit in Northampton, to a comparatively muted response. In Enfield, something different happened. The sermon was called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and its central image is one of the most famous in American religious history. Edwards told his listeners that they hung over the pit of hell the way a spider dangles over a fire, suspended by nothing but the thin, arbitrary mercy of God, who was under no obligation whatsoever to keep holding them up. He told them their own righteousness was worth nothing, that at any moment, this very sentence, the thread could simply be let go. This was not an abstract theological point for Edwards. It was meant to be felt immediately and physically by every person in the room, right now, before the sermon ended. It worked, and it worked in a way that terrified the people running the service as much as it moved the congregation. Contemporary accounts describe people in the Enfield church moaning and crying out loud in the middle of the sermon. Not politely, not at the end, but during it, so loudly that Edwards reportedly had to stop and wait, more than once, for people to be quiet enough for him to continue. Some clutched the pillars and pew backs of the church, apparently under the impression that they were already sliding down into the pit Edwards had just described. This was not staged. Edwards was, by temperament, one of the least theatrical preachers of his era, which is precisely why the reaction mattered so much. If a monotone reader of a written sermon could produce this kind of collective terror, something had shifted in what religious language was capable of doing to a crowd of ordinary, sober New Englanders. What was actually at stake in that room in Enfield? For the individuals sitting in the pew, it was nothing less than the eternal fate of their soul, and Edwards was not interested in softening that. But there was a second, quieter stake running underneath the first, the authority of the established church itself. If people could be moved this profoundly, this directly, by a message that bypassed the slow, formal, doctrinally careful preaching most ministers had been trained to deliver, then the whole machinery of religious authority, years of seminary training, ordination, denominational hierarchy, suddenly looked less essential. If God could reach straight into an individual heart in the middle of a sermon and produce an undeniable, visible, physical response, then what exactly was the minister actually necessary for? Edwards himself never intended to undermine his own profession, but the genie he helped let out of the bottle in Enfield would, within a few years, be used by people with far less formal training and far less patience for institutional caution. Starting with a 25-year-old Englishman who was, by any measure, the first transatlantic religious celebrity in history. If Edwards proved that raw religious terror could still move a New England congregation, George Whitefield proved something even more consequential, that it could move everyone, everywhere, regardless of denomination, geography, or social class, and that a single preacher, with no fixed parish at all, could become as famous across an entire continent as any European monarch. Whitefield was a former actor and barkeep's son from Gloucester, England, ordained as an Anglican deacon who discovered early in his career that he had a physical gift most preachers of his generation simply did not possess: a voice. Contemporaries, including skeptics who had no religious stake in flattering him, claimed Whitefield's voice could carry outdoors without amplification of any kind to crowds of 10, 20, even 30,000 people. Benjamin Franklin, who was no evangelical and freely admitted he didn't believe most of Whitefield's theology, was curious enough about this claim that he actually conducted an experiment. He walked backward away from Whitefield during an open-air sermon in Philadelphia, counting paces, trying to find the exact distance at which the voice became inaudible, and calculated from the area of the resulting circle that Whitefield could plausibly be heard clearly by over 30,000 people at once. Franklin, ever the pragmatist, would go on to become Whitefield's publisher and business partner, printing and distributing his sermons for profit. A small but telling detail, because it shows that Whitefield's fame had already outgrown religious phenomenon and become something closer to a media event. What Whitefield actually did, physically, mattered as much as what he said. He refused to stay inside a single church building the way an ordinary parish minister was expected to. Instead, he preached wherever a crowd could gather. Town squares, open fields, hillsides. A practice that scandalized much of the existing clergy, who saw it as an assault on the entire parish system in which every minister had a defined congregation and defined territorial authority. Whitefield didn't care whose territory he was in. He crossed the Atlantic 7 times over the course of his career and toured up and down the American colonies, from Georgia to New England, preaching to Anglicans, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, and plenty of people who belonged to no church at all, treating denominational boundaries as an inconvenience rather than a rule. Here's what made this dangerous, and it's worth being explicit about the stakes, because it's easy for modern readers to miss just how radical this looked in the 1740s. Established clergy in every colony he visited had built entire careers around the assumption that religious authority was territorial and institutional. You belonged to this parish, answered to this minister, and received your religious instruction through this particular chain of ordained authority. Whitefield's traveling, outdoor, cross-denominational preaching quietly but unmistakably communicated a different message to the tens of thousands who came to hear him. Your salvation does not depend on which parish you happen to live in or which minister happens to have jurisdiction over your town. It depends on your own heart, and it can be reached by whoever manages to move you, regardless of his ordination papers. For the ordinary colonist, that was liberating, an offer of direct, unmediated access to God, no institutional gatekeeper required. For the settled clergy watching their own congregations empty out to go hear a traveling Englishman preach in a field, it looked like the beginning of the end of their entire professional world. Both readings were, in a sense, correct, and the tension between them didn't resolve quietly. That tension broke churches apart, quite literally, and the fracture it produced has a name that historians still use: the divide between New Lights and Old Lights. New Lights were the revival's supporters, clergy and lay people who believed that the emotional intensity on display in Edwards's and Whitefield's meetings was genuine evidence of the Holy Spirit at work, and that a Christianity without that intensity was, in some sense, dead already. Old Lights were the skeptics, often equally devout, equally learned, sometimes even more theologically sophisticated, who worried that mass emotional displays were, at best, an unreliable guide to genuine faith and, at worst, a dangerous form of religious hysteria that could be manipulated by any sufficiently charismatic speaker, true believer, or con artist alike. This was not an abstract disagreement conducted in academic journals. Congregations split. Ministers were forced out of pulpits they had held for decades because their congregations no longer trusted their spiritual authority, or because they refused to invite popular revivalist preachers to speak. New breakaway, new light congregations sprang up throughout New England, often led by younger, less formally trained ministers who had never attended the elite colleges that had traditionally produced the colonial clergy. That last detail carries more weight than it might first appear to. Part of what the revival did, not as an explicit political program, but as a side effect of its own internal logic, was quietly undermine the idea that education, ordination, and social standing were prerequisites for religious authority. If an uneducated farmer could feel the direct, unmistakable presence of God in a way that his formally trained minister apparently could not produce in his own sermons, then the farmer had, in a real sense, gained a kind of spiritual standing that didn't depend on Harvard or Yale, on family connections, or on any of the traditional markers of colonial elite status. Lay exhorters, ordinary members of the congregation with no formal theological training at all, began preaching and leading prayer meetings, something that would have been unthinkable in the highly credentialed, ministerially controlled churches of a generation earlier. It is worth lingering for a moment on one particular stop on Whitefield's tour, because it captures the scale of what was happening better than any summary can. When Whitefield preached in Boston in 1740, contemporary estimates suggest as much as a third of the entire population of the town turned out to hear him at once. In a colonial city with no radio, no printing press capable of instant mass communication, no way of spreading news except by word of mouth, letter, and newspaper notices that traveled at the speed of a horse. Word of his arrival in a town could produce a crowd of thousands within a day or two of his stepping off a ship, an almost unimaginable feat of informal, word-of-mouth organizing for the era. Ministers who had spent their careers slowly, patiently building congregations of a few hundred loyal parishioners watched a 25-year-old outsider draw more people to a single afternoon sermon in a field than most of them would preach to in a decade. Some tried to compete by adopting Whitefield's more emotional, direct preaching style themselves. Others tried to have him barred from preaching in their towns entirely, arguing, not unreasonably from their own point of view, that an unaffiliated traveling preacher had no legitimate business drawing away another minister's congregation. Both responses, ironically, only confirmed how much authority Whitefield had already accumulated without holding a single official position anywhere. This is the point where the bridge to the wider political story of colonial America starts to become visible, even if none of the participants fully saw it themselves at the time. A society that spends decades getting comfortable with the idea that ordinary, uneducated, non-elite people can access ultimate spiritual truth directly without needing to defer to an inherited chain of institutional authority is a society that has already done a significant amount of the psychological groundwork needed to ask a very similar question about political authority a generation later. Historians disagree, reasonably, about how much causal weight to put on this connection. Some argue the First Great Awakening directly seeded revolutionary sentiment. Others argue the link is looser, more of a shared cultural mood than a direct cause. What's harder to dispute is the timing and the texture. The same colonists who spent the 1740s learning to distrust inherited religious authority and to trust their own individual, emotional experience of truth would spend the 1760s and 1770s applying strikingly similar logic to the question of whether a king 3,000 miles away, whom they had never met and had not chosen, had any legitimate claim to rule over their consciences or their taxes. By the mid-1740s, though, the first wave of revival fervor had largely burned itself out. Whitefield kept touring for another 3 decades, but the mass hysteria of the early 1740s cooled into something more institutionalized, more denominationally organized, less explosive. The awakening didn't disappear. It left behind new colleges. Several of the future Ivy League schools trace roots to this era's religious controversies, new denominations, and a permanently altered religious landscape. But the country that would eventually reignite this fire wasn't the tight, settled colonial society of the 1740s. It was something almost unrecognizably different, a brand new independent republic sprawling rapidly westward into territory with no churches, no ministers, and, from the perspective of anxious Eastern clergy, no religion at all. And it's worth pausing on just how different the setting is, because the differences explain almost everything about why the Second Great Awakening looked and felt so different from the first. The American Revolution didn't just create a new government. It created, almost as a side effect, a genuine religious crisis. The Anglican Church, discredited by its association with the British Crown, collapsed as an institutional force in huge parts of the new country. Meanwhile, waves of settlers were pouring across the Appalachians into Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley, territory with essentially no established religious infrastructure whatsoever. No church buildings, no settled ministers making regular rounds, no Sunday schools, no seminaries, no denominational bureaucracy of any kind. Just isolated farms and rough frontier settlements scattered across enormous distances, populated by people who in many cases had had no meaningful contact with organized religion in years. To Eastern religious leaders watching this unfold, it looked like a catastrophe in slow motion. An entire generation of Americans growing up essentially unchurched on a frontier widely rumored, with considerable exaggeration but not zero basis, to be a place of drinking, brawling, and moral chaos. And here is where the stakes of the Second Great Awakening come into sharper focus. This wasn't simply a theological project. It was, in the minds of the people who organized it, a race against the literal disintegration of American Christianity in the one part of the country growing fastest. If the frontier could not be reached, evangelical leaders believed an entire vast stretch of the new nation would simply grow up outside the reach of the church altogether and might never be brought back into it. The tool that emerged to solve this problem was, in its way, a piece of pure logistical genius: the camp meeting. If frontier settlers were too spread out, too isolated, and too far from any church building to be reached the ordinary way, then the church would have to come to them all at once, for days at a stretch, in the open air, essentially reconstructing, without quite realizing it, the format Whitefield had pioneered 60 years earlier, but supercharged for a frontier population desperate for both religious meaning and, frankly, human company. Which is exactly what produced Cane Ridge. Now that the context is in place, it's worth returning to that field in Kentucky and asking, more precisely, what the people there thought was happening to them and why the physical extremity of it mattered so much. The frontier camp meeting solved a genuine social problem before it solved a spiritual one. For settlers living in scattered isolation, sometimes going months without seeing more than their own immediate family, the camp meeting was one of the only opportunities in a given year to be part of a genuine crowd. To sing together, eat together, camp together, court potential spouses, trade news, and, yes, experience an intensity of shared emotion that daily frontier life almost never offered. That social hunger and the religious hunger reinforced each other, and the preachers running these meetings understood, whether or not they articulated it this cynically, that the combination of physical exhaustion, people had often traveled for days and gotten little sleep, crowd psychology, days of continuous preaching and genuine religious conviction, was capable of producing exactly the kind of overwhelming, involuntary physical response that observers recorded at Cane Ridge. The falling, the jerks, the barking, the visions. For the people experiencing it, this was not embarrassing or shameful. It was proof. In a religious culture that had spent a century since Edward's Enfield sermon increasingly treating overwhelming emotional and physical response as evidence of genuine conversion, as opposed to the polite, unmoved formality of old light religion. Collapsing, weeping, or shaking uncontrollably was widely read by participants as a sign that the Holy Spirit had genuinely, undeniably touched them. The stakes for the individual convert were exactly what they had been at Enfield, their eternal soul made suddenly, physically real to them in a way ordinary church attendance had never managed. But the frontier setting raised the stakes in a second, more immediate way too. This was quite possibly the only chance an isolated settler would get, for years, to have this experience at all. There was real pressure, real urgency in that 6-day window, which helps explain why people pushed themselves, physically and emotionally, further than they might have in a more routine religious setting. Not everyone who witnessed Cane Ridge came away a believer in what they'd seen. Plenty of contemporary observers, including some sympathetic clergy, were disturbed by the physical extremity of the jerks and worried, not unreasonably, that the whole spectacle discredited serious religion in the eyes of skeptics. Presbyterian church leadership, in particular, grew increasingly uncomfortable with camp meeting excesses over the following years, and some of the ministers involved in organizing Cane Ridge eventually broke away to help found new denominations, including the movement that would become the Disciples of Christ/Christian Church, rather than face official Presbyterian censure. The revival didn't just save souls, in other words. It reorganized the entire American religious map, spinning off new denominations and permanently weakening the idea that there was, or should be, any single dominant established church at all. Now, move forward roughly 2 decades, and the story takes a strange turn. The raw, uncontrolled emotional chaos of Cane Ridge gets systematized, turned quite deliberately into a repeatable technique by a lawyer-turned-preacher named Charles Grandison Finney. And this shift matters enormously because it marks the moment revivalism stopped being something that happened to people and started being something that could be engineered to happen to them. Finney had trained as a lawyer before an intense, sudden conversion experience in 1821 redirected him toward ministry, and he brought a lawyer's instinct for argument, persuasion, and procedures into the pulpit with him. Where earlier revivalists, including Edwards, had generally believed that genuine religious awakening was fundamentally a mysterious, sovereign act of God, something that could be hoped for and prayed for, but not manufactured. Finney flatly rejected that idea. He argued, controversially, that revival was not a miracle, but the predictable result of the right combination of methods, correctly applied, the same way a farmer could predictably grow a crop by using the right techniques rather than waiting passively for divine intervention. That was a genuinely radical theological claim, and it's worth being clear about what was at stake in making it. If Finney was right, then any sufficiently skilled and dedicated preacher could produce mass religious conversion more or less on demand, using identifiable, teachable techniques, which was either wonderful news. Revival could now be spread reliably, on purpose, wherever it was needed, or deeply troubling news. It blurred the line between genuine spiritual transformation and simple psychological manipulation, depending entirely on who you asked. Finney's actual toolkit, which he called the New Measures, included several specific innovations that would go on to define American mass evangelism for the next 2 centuries. He extended single evening services into protracted meetings that ran for days or even weeks running, on the theory that sustained emotional pressure over time was more effective at producing lasting conversion than a single sermon. He encouraged extremely direct, personal, even confrontational language aimed at specific individuals in the congregation, rather than the general, abstract exhortations more traditional preachers favored. Naming sin specifically, addressing sinners as though speaking to them personally, one at a time. And most famously, he introduced the anxious bench, sometimes called the anxious seat. A specific bench or row at the front of the meeting where people who felt they were on the verge of conversion could come forward, publicly, sit down, and be prayed over directly by the preacher and other believers, in full view of the entire congregation. The anxious bench deserves particular attention because the stakes involved in that single piece of furniture were genuinely high for the people who sat on it and genuinely controversial for the church leaders who debated whether to allow it. For the individual, walking forward in front of hundreds of neighbors, friends, and family members to sit on that bench was an enormous act of public vulnerability. An irreversible, visible commitment that could not later be quietly walked back without social consequence. That was precisely the point. Finney believed the public commitment itself helped produce the genuine internal transformation, rather than simply reflecting a transformation that had already happened privately. Critics, and there were many, especially among more traditional Calvinist clergy, argued that this reversed the proper order of things dangerously, that Finney was essentially manufacturing the appearance of conversion through social pressure and theatrical staging, rather than waiting for genuine grace, and that people who came forward under that pressure might mistake a moment of public emotion for real spiritual transformation, with potentially serious long-term consequences for their sincere faith. Underneath this methodological argument sat a bigger theological earthquake, and it's the one that arguably matters most for understanding everything that follows. Finney, and the Second Great Awakening more broadly, represented a decisive break from the old Calvinist doctrine of predestination, the belief dominant in colonial New England Puritanism and still powerful in the 18th century, that God had already determined, before the beginning of time, exactly who would be saved and who would be damned, and that no human choice or effort could alter that eternal decision one way or the other. Finney rejected this almost entirely, teaching instead a version of Arminian theology that put the emphasis squarely on individual free will. Salvation was available to anyone who genuinely chose it, and the entire apparatus of revivalism, the protracted meetings, the anxious bench, the emotional appeals, existed precisely to help people make that choice, right now, tonight. It is genuinely hard to overstate how much this theological shift mattered outside of church walls. A religious culture built around predestination is, whatever its theological merits, a fundamentally passive one when it comes to individual agency. Your eternal fate was sealed before you were born, and nothing you do changes it. A religious culture built around free will and individual choice is active, urgent, and, crucially, democratic in its underlying logic. Everyone, regardless of birth, education, or social standing, has exactly the same capacity to choose salvation, right now, through their own will. That shift in religious imagination ran on precisely the same track as the political and social shifts already underway in Jacksonian America. The expansion of voting rights to non-property-owning white men, the growing suspicion of inherited elites, the widening conviction that ordinary individuals, not just aristocrats and the specially credentialed, were capable of self-governance, moral and political both. Finney's revivalism and Jacksonian democracy were not the same movement, but they were unmistakably breathing the same cultural air. From here, we move from a story about religious technique into a story about American history more broadly. The Second Great Awakening's insistence that ordinary individuals could and should choose to transform themselves did not stay contained inside church walls. It exploded outward into some of the most consequential social reform movements of the 19th century, and the stakes involved were, for the first time in this story, not just eternal. They were immediate, legal, and, in the most serious cases, matters of literal life, death, and freedom. The logic connecting revivalism to reform was, once you see it, fairly direct. If Finney was right that individuals could choose righteousness through an act of will, and if genuine conversion was expected to produce a visibly transformed, more moral life afterward, then it followed almost naturally that a truly converted Christian could not simply sit comfortably while surrounded by what revivalists increasingly identified as glaring, undeniable social sins, chief among them, in the eyes of a growing number of northern evangelicals, chattel slavery. This is where the story's stakes rise sharply, because the movement that emerged from this theological logic, abolitionism, was not a polite policy debate. It was a direct assault on the economic foundation of the entire southern United States, an institution defended by law, by violence, and eventually by war. Theodore Dwight Weld, one of Finney's own converts and students, became one of the most effective abolitionist organizers in the country, training dozens of traveling anti-slavery lecturers using techniques directly borrowed from revivalist preaching. Sustained, emotionally intense, morally confrontational speaking tours aimed at producing immediate conviction and action, exactly the way a Finney revival aimed to produce immediate religious conversion. For enslaved people, obviously, the stakes of this movement were about as high as stakes get: freedom itself and everything freedom made possible. For the Southern planter class, the stakes were equally stark from the opposite direction. The abolitionist movement, gathering force out of evangelical revivalism, represented an existential threat to their entire economic and social order. And they responded over the following decades with escalating political resistance that would eventually help drive the country into civil war. Temperance was a smaller stakes fight in the sense that it didn't split the nation in two, but it carried enormous weight inside individual families and communities, where alcohol abuse genuinely devastated households, and revivalist temperance campaigns gave women in particular, who otherwise had almost no formal political voice, no vote, and limited legal standing, one of their first large-scale platforms for organized public activism. That matters more than it might initially seem. Women who cut their organizing teeth running temperance campaigns and revival meetings went on, in significant numbers, to become leaders in the abolitionist movement and, eventually, the early women's rights movement. A direct organizational and personal pipeline running from the pews of Second Great Awakening revivals to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Sojourner Truth, a formerly enslaved woman who became one of the most powerful abolitionist and women's rights speakers in American history, was herself a product of this same evangelical revival culture, having undergone a profound religious conversion experience that she credited with giving her the moral authority and personal conviction to speak publicly, defying deeply entrenched norms about who was permitted to address mixed public audiences. Education reform and early prison reform movements grew out of similar evangelical soil. If literacy was necessary so that ordinary people could read the Bible and personally judge scriptural truth for themselves, a distinctly Protestant and distinctly democratic idea running all the way back to the Reformation, then expanding schools and literacy, was itself a religious project, not merely a civic one. Prison reformers, similarly, argued from an evangelical premise that even the most hardened criminal retained the individual capacity for genuine moral transformation. The same free will logic Finney preached from the pulpit applied now to penal policy. It's worth putting a human face on how directly this pipeline ran, because it is easy to describe as an abstract cultural current and much harder to see as the lived, risky decisions of actual people. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a wealthy South Carolina slave-holding family, underwent evangelical conversions that led them first to reject their own family's participation in slavery, then to move north, and eventually to become two of the first women in American history to lecture publicly to mixed audiences of men and women on the subject of abolition. An act so far outside accepted norms for female public conduct that even sympathetic male abolitionists worried it would discredit the cause, and the Congregational Clergy of Massachusetts issued a formal pastoral letter condemning women who so far forget themselves as to instruct men in public. The Grimke sisters kept lecturing anyway, and in doing so, connected two arguments that would otherwise have taken much longer to meet. If evangelical conversion gave a person direct individual access to moral truth regardless of their social rank, then a woman's sex was no more a legitimate barrier to speaking that truth publicly than an enslaved person's race was a legitimate justification for owning them. That argument, forged directly out of revivalist theology, fed straight into the movement that would produce the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Where a declaration of sentiments modeled explicitly on the Declaration of Independence demanded, among other things, the right of women to vote, a document whose organizers, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had themselves come up through the same reform culture that revivalism had built. By the 1840s, in other words, the line between religious revival and social reform movement in large parts of the American North had become almost impossible to draw cleanly. This was the Second Great Awakening's most consequential legacy, and it set a pattern, religious conviction translating directly into organized political and social action that would recur in different forms for the rest of American history. The final act of this story requires another significant scene change. And once again, the change in setting explains almost everything about the change in the religious response that followed. By the 1850s, and accelerating dramatically after the Civil War, the frontier camp meeting was no longer where the action was. The country's center of gravity had shifted decisively toward the industrial city. Millions of immigrants poured into rapidly growing urban centers. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, often crowded into slums and tenements under conditions of poverty, disease, and labor exploitation that had no real precedent in earlier American experience. The problems facing this new America were not the isolation and religious vacancy of a sparsely settled frontier. They were the crushing density and inequality of the industrial city. Revivalism, characteristically, adapted to meet the new terrain, and this third Great Awakening looks, on the surface, considerably less wild than Cane Ridge. No barking, generally no jerks. But it arguably left an even deeper institutional footprint on American religious and civic life. Where the frontier camp meeting had been informal, spontaneous, and largely unorganized, urban revivalism in this era became a matter of large, carefully coordinated institutions. Denominations built enormous missionary societies. Some aimed at converting the growing immigrant populations within American cities, and some aimed at spreading Christianity internationally, launching the modern era of American global missionary work. Dwight L. Moody, a former shoe salesman turned full-time evangelist, became the era's Whitefield equivalent celebrity preacher, drawing enormous urban crowds using a warmer, less hellfire-focused, more emotionally reassuring preaching style than Edwards's or even Finney's, better suited to city dwellers who were already living amid enough daily hardship without needing more of it invoked from the pulpit. Two distinct theological currents branched off from this urban revival moment, and the contrast between them is worth sitting with because it captures a genuine, unresolved tension inside the whole revivalist tradition about what saving people actually meant. The first was the holiness movement, which pushed the individual transformation logic of earlier revivalism even further, emphasizing a second blessing of complete personal sanctification after conversion. A state of moral perfection believers sought through intense personal devotion. This movement, still overwhelmingly focused on individual spiritual experience, would go on within a few decades to produce Pentecostalism, with its distinctive emphasis on direct physical manifestations of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, divine healing that in some ways echoed, more than a century later, the uncontrolled physical ecstasy of Cane Ridge, just with new theological vocabulary attached to explain it. The second current, the social gospel movement, pushed in almost the opposite direction, arguing that individual conversion alone was an inadequate response to the scale of suffering visible in industrial cities, and that genuine Christian ethics demanded direct engagement with structural social problems: poverty, dangerous labor conditions, slum housing, child labor, rather than simply hoping that enough individual converts would eventually add up to social change. Walter Rauschenbusch, the movement's most influential theologian, had spent years as a pastor in one of New York's poorest immigrant neighborhoods before concluding that no amount of individual piety could fix what he came to see as sinful social systems, not just sinful individual hearts. The stakes of this argument were significant because it represented a genuine fork in the road for American Protestantism. Was the point of religion to save individual souls one at a time, exactly as Edwards, Whitefield, and Finney had all assumed? Or was it to reform unjust systems and structures directly? That argument, unresolved in the 1890s, has never fully gone away. It runs in recognizable form through American religious and political debates to this day. So, back to the question that opened this whole story. Why would a nation built on Enlightenment reason keep erupting, generation after generation, into episodes of raw, uncontrolled religious emotion, and why does it matter? Pull back far enough, and a clear pattern runs underneath all three awakenings, different as they looked on the surface. Each one, in its own way, was a rebellion against comfortable, institutionalized, credential-gated religious authority, and each one replaced it, at least partially, with the radical idea that ordinary individuals, uneducated farmers, enslaved women, immigrant factory workers, frontier settlers with no access to a church for years at a stretch, had exactly the same direct access to ultimate truth as any bishop, any Harvard-trained minister, any established denominational hierarchy. That idea, repeated and reinforced across a century of revivals, did something to the broader American political imagination that none of the individual preachers fully intended or predicted. A people who have spent generations being told and periodically shown in visceral, physical, undeniable form that they do not need permission from an inherited authority to access the most important truth there is, are a people who are going to eventually ask the same question about the authority governing their taxes, their laws, and their votes. None of this happened cleanly or without enormous cost. The same revivalist energy that helped fuel abolitionism also, in its holiness and Pentecostal offshoots, sometimes retreated from social engagement entirely into purely private, individual piety. The same emphasis on emotional, physical conversion experience that gave enslaved people and disenfranchised women rare platforms for public religious authority also produced, at various points across this history, genuine exploitation, manipulation, and fraud, as skeptics from the old lights of the 1740s onward correctly warned it might. And the fracturing of religious authority that all three awakenings accelerated left America with, by international standards, an extraordinarily fragmented religious landscape. Thousands of denominations and independent congregations. No single established church, a condition that is itself a direct legacy of a century spent breaking apart existing institutions in the name of unmediated individual religious experience. But walk the through line one more time, because it's the clearest way to answer the question this whole story was built around. A quiet, monotone minister in Enfield, Connecticut in 1741 made a room full of comfortable New Englanders believe, for one terrifying hour, that their eternal souls hung by a thread. A traveling English preacher with an astonishing voice convinced tens of thousands of colonists across every denomination and every colony that they didn't need a parish minister's permission to find God. A lawyer-turned-evangelist decided that revival wasn't a miracle to wait for, but a method that could be engineered, and in doing so helped teach an entire nation that individual will, not inherited fate, determine the outcome of a life. And in a field in Kentucky, in the summer heat of 1801, thousands of isolated frontier Americans who had gone years without a church or a crowd or a moment of shared human intensity fell to the ground, wept, shook, and barked, and came away from it convinced, in the most physical and undeniable way they knew how to be convinced of anything, that they mattered directly to God, with no bishop, no king, and no inherited social rank standing in between. That conviction, that ordinary people possess on their own direct and unmediated access to ultimate truth and ultimate authority, is a religious idea. But it is also, whether the preachers who spread it fully realized it or not, one of the most explosive political ideas in modern history. America spent a century having it proven to itself over and over in fields and forests and city missions, through tears and terror and the anxious bench. And by the time the fires finally settled into the more familiar, institutionalized evangelical Christianity of the 20th century, the idea had already done its most important work. Before this story can honestly close, it needs to make room for the people who watched all of this happen and were not persuaded, because their objections tell us almost as much about the stakes involved as the revivals themselves do. And because, frankly, some of their warnings turned out to be correct. Charles Chauncey, a Boston minister and one of the most articulate Old Light critics of the First Great Awakening, wrote an entire book Seasonable Thoughts on the State of Religion in New England, arguing that what Edwards and Whitefield were calling the work of the Holy Spirit was, in a great many cases, nothing more than uncontrolled human passion dressed up in religious language. Chauncey was not a religious skeptic in any modern sense. He was a devout, seriously trained minister who believed just as sincerely in salvation and damnation as Edwards did. His objection was narrower and, in its way, more interesting. He believed that true religion resided in the understanding, in a reasoned, considered assent to the truth of the gospel, and that mistaking violent emotional upheaval for genuine faith was not just an error, but a dangerous one, because it left ordinary people vulnerable to being moved, manipulated, or misled by anyone skilled enough at working a crowd, whether or not that person's doctrine was sound. He pointed, with some justification, to the itinerant preacher James Davenport, a Whitefield admirer whose revival meetings in Connecticut grew so extreme. Public book burnings, believers publicly diagnosing which of their neighbors were damned, congregants disrobing in what they described as a rejection of worldly vanity. That even other New Light ministers eventually distanced themselves from him, and colonial authorities briefly had him arrested. Davenport's excesses were an outlier, not the norm, but Old Lights used him relentlessly to argue that the entire revival, taken as a whole, was one loose thread away from social chaos. The stakes of this argument were genuinely high on both sides, and it's worth taking a moment to sit inside each position rather than assuming the revivalists were simply right and their critics simply reactionary defenders of a dying establishment. If Chauncey and the Old Lights were correct, if mass emotional religious experience really was mostly crowd psychology rather than divine action, then the entire New Light movement risked teaching an entire generation of colonists to trust their most intense feelings over their reasoned judgment, a habit of mind that could be, and arguably was, exploited by demagogues of every kind for centuries afterward, religious and political alike. If Edwards and Whitefield were correct, on the other hand, then Chauncey's cool, reasoned, institutionally cautious religion was exactly the kind of complacent, spiritually dead Christianity that was going to leave an entire generation ignorant of their own eternal peril, comfortable in pews while damned. Neither side, notably, ever fully won this argument, and versions of it is genuine conviction measured by feeling or by reason. Does emotional intensity indicate truth or gullibility? Still surface constantly in arguments about religion, politics, and media manipulation today. Similar critiques resurfaced, nearly identically, at every later stage of this story. Educated observers at Cane Ridge, including some of the Presbyterian ministers who had helped organize it, grew alarmed enough at the physical extremity of the jerks and the barking exercise that the Presbyterian Church's own governing bodies eventually moved to formally distance themselves from unrestrained camp meeting practices, worried that the spectacle was making organized Christianity look ridiculous to skeptical outside observers precisely when the new republic needed religion to look credible and stable. Some of the ministers most closely associated with organizing Cane Ridge, rather than accept that institutional censure, broke away entirely and helped found new, independent congregations and eventually new denominations, meaning that even the backlash against the revival's excesses ended up, ironically, accelerating the same process of religious fragmentation the revival had already set in motion. Finney faced an even sharper version of the same argument a generation later, and from an unexpected direction. Many of his critics were not stiff traditionalists defending a moribund establishment, but serious, committed Calvinist theologians who worried specifically about his claim that revival could be produced through correct method rather than awaited as an act of divine sovereignty. Asahel Nettleton, an older, highly respected revivalist preacher who had himself led successful, much less theatrical New England revivals in the 1820s, became one of Finney's most persistent critics, arguing that the anxious bench and Finney's other new measures manufactured emotional spectacle rather than genuine, lasting conversion, and that congregations converted under this kind of pressure would show, within a few years, unusually high rates of falling away from the faith entirely, a claim that later religious historians have found at least partial evidence to support. The argument here again cuts close to something that still matters well outside religious history. Does intensifying pressure and urgency in the moment of decision produce durable commitment, or does it produce a kind of emotional overcommitment that collapses once the pressure lifts? Modern marketers, political campaigns, and self-help programs all wrestle, in secular language, with exactly the question Nettleton was raising about Finney's altar calls in the 1820s. There is one more figure worth pulling into sharper focus before this story reaches its true end, because his story crystallizes the tension running through the entire Third Great Awakening, and because the argument he lost, in a sense, is still being fought. Walter Rauschenbusch spent 11 years as the pastor of a small German Baptist congregation in a New York neighborhood called Hell's Kitchen, a name that, by the 1880s, was not remotely exaggerated. He watched, week after week, funerals for children who had died of preventable diseases traceable directly to overcrowded, poorly ventilated tenement housing. He watched fathers in his congregation lose fingers, hands, sometimes their lives in factory accidents that occurred because employers had no legal obligation to install even the most basic safety guards on dangerous machinery. He had been trained, like every minister in the revivalist tradition running back through Moody and Finney to Edwards, to understand his job as saving individual souls one at a time through personal conversion. And he came, slowly and with real anguish, to believe that this framework was simply inadequate to what he was watching happen to his own congregation. What was at stake in Rauschenbusch's reformulation of Christian ministry was not abstract. If he was right that sin operated at the level of unjust economic and social systems, landlords who profited from unsafe housing, employers who profited from unsafe factories, a political system that offered immigrant workers almost no legal protection against either, then saving individual souls, one convert at a time, while leaving those systems untouched, was treating a symptom while the disease raged on uncontrolled. That was a serious accusation to level at more than a century of American revivalist Christianity, and it did not go over quietly. Traditional evangelicals, heirs to Moody's individually focused urban revivalism and to the holiness movement's emphasis on personal sanctification, accused the social gospel of abandoning the actual gospel altogether, of replacing the message of personal salvation with what amounted to a secular political program wearing religious language as a disguise. Some of that critique stuck hard enough that American Protestantism effectively split, over the following decades, into two increasingly separate camps. A more theologically and socially conservative evangelicalism that kept its focus on individual conversion, personal morality, and, eventually, direct, ecstatic spiritual experience through the Pentecostal movement, and a more theologically liberal mainline Protestantism that increasingly emphasized social reform, structural justice, and engagement with secular political movements. That split, first opened wide by the argument between Moody's individual conversion revivalism and Rauschenbusch's social gospel in the 1880s and 1890s, is arguably the single most important dividing line running through American Christianity for the entire 20th century and into the 21st, visible in everything from denominational splits to the very different political alignments of, say, a Pentecostal megachurch and a mainline Protestant congregation active in a local labor or housing coalition. Neither side of that split ever fully disappeared, and neither side ever fully won. The question Rauschenbusch forced into the open: does authentic Christian faith require reforming unjust systems, or does it primarily require transforming individual hearts? is, in updated language, still one of the most contested questions inside American religious and political life today. One final scene belongs in this story because it shows the fire from Cane Ridge, more than a century later, finding its most direct spiritual descendant in a setting almost nobody expected. In 1906, in a rundown former Methodist church building on Azusa Street in Los Angeles, a building so plain that it had most recently served as a horse stable and warehouse, an African-American preacher named William Seymour, the son of formerly enslaved parents, began holding revival meetings that would grow, within months, into one of the most consequential religious events of the 20th century. Seymour, who had studied briefly under a holiness preacher in Texas, taught that the same baptism of the Holy Spirit described in the biblical book of Acts, accompanied by speaking in unknown tongues, physical healing, and other direct, unmistakable spiritual manifestations, was available to believers in the present day, not just to the apostles of the ancient church. What happened at Azusa Street, in raw physical terms, would have looked entirely familiar to anyone who had witnessed Cane Ridge over a century earlier. People falling to the ground, speaking in what witnesses described as unknown languages, shaking, weeping, reporting visions and physical healings. The theological vocabulary had changed. This was now framed specifically as the biblical gift of tongues, a doctrinal claim Cane Ridge's Presbyterian organizers would never have made. But the underlying pattern of overwhelming, involuntary physical religious experience, offered as undeniable, embodied proof of direct, divine contact, was unmistakably the same current that had been running through American revivalism since Jonathan Edwards's Enfield congregation clutched the pillars of their pews in 1741. What made Azusa Street especially remarkable, and especially dangerous by the standards of its era, was who was in the room together. In the deeply, legally segregated Los Angeles of 1906, Black, white, Latino, and Asian worshippers prayed, sang, and fell to the floor, side by side at Azusa Street, under the leadership of a black preacher, an arrangement that violated nearly every social convention of the time, and drew furious condemnation from the mainstream press, which described the meetings using openly racist language and characterized the racially integrated worship itself as evidence of the movement's supposed depravity. The stakes here were not merely theological. A racially integrated religious movement led by a black man, drawing enormous national and eventually international attention, was a direct, visible challenge to the entire racial order of early 20th century America. And the movement paid a real social price for it, as later Pentecostal denominations gradually resegregated along the same racial lines as the rest of American Christianity, a retreat that later Pentecostal historians have generally treated as a genuine loss rather than a natural correction. Pentecostalism that emerged from Azusa Street would go on to become, over the following century, one of the fastest-growing religious movements on the entire planet, reshaping Christianity not just in the United States but across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And it is worth pausing at the very end of this long story on the strange symmetry of that fact. The same raw, uncontrolled, physically overwhelming religious experience that terrified respectable Boston ministers when it appeared in a Connecticut church in 1741, and that alarmed even its own Presbyterian organizers when it appeared in a Kentucky field in 1801, turned out in a different century and in a converted horse stable in Los Angeles to be the seed of a global religious movement now numbering in the hundreds of millions. The fire, the old lights, and the cautious Presbyterians tried, at every stage, to contain, redirect, or disown, never actually went out. It kept finding new fuel, new preachers, and new forms. Return for a moment to where this story began. To the mud, the wagons, the smoke of 1,000 campfires, and the sound of 7 preachers shouting scripture at once across a Kentucky field in August 1801. It should look different now than it did on the first page. What looked, at first glance, like a crowd of ordinary people losing their minds was in fact the visible surface of something that had been building quietly and then not so quietly for 70 years. Since a monotone minister in Enfield made a congregation believe they were dangling over hell by a thread, since an English preacher's voice carried across 30,000 people in a Philadelphia field, since churches split down the middle over whether an uneducated farmer's tears counted as evidence of God's presence. Every jerk, every bark, every collapse at Cane Ridge was, in a strange way, an argument being made with the body instead of the tongue. An argument that ordinary, unlettered, unranked human beings had exactly the same access to ultimate truth as any bishop or magistrate, and that this access didn't require anyone's permission. It is tempting, looking back from more than 2 centuries later, to sort the entire story into winners and losers. To say the revivalists were right, the old lights and the Nettletons and the Chaunceys were fussy obstacles standing in the way of a spiritual awakening the country needed. That would be too simple, and this story has tried, at every stage, to resist it. The critics were not always wrong. Manufactured urgency did sometimes produce shallow, short-lived conversions. Emotional crowds were, and remain, genuinely vulnerable to manipulation by whoever is skilled enough to work them, for reasons that have nothing to do with truth. Religious fragmentation, which every wave of awakening accelerated, left America without the kind of unifying national religious institution that many European nations retained, for better and for worse. None of that cancels out what the revivals also did. But it belongs in the final accounting, because the people who lived through this history experienced both sides of it as real. What can be said without much hedging is this. The central question this whole story was built around: why would a nation of Enlightenment rationalists keep collapsing into waves of uncontrolled religious feeling, generation after generation? Has one answer that holds up across all 3 awakenings, however differently each one dressed itself. Every single time the fire broke out precisely where inherited, credentialed, institutional authority had grown too comfortable, too distant, or too irrelevant to the lives of the people it claimed to serve. A complacent New England clergy in the 1730s, an absent, unbuilt church on a violent frontier in the 1790s, an urban immigrant working class, the older Protestant establishment, had no idea how to reach in the 1880s. And every single time what rushed in to fill that gap was not a new institution handed down from above, but an experience, sudden, physical, individual, undeniable, that told the person having it that they, personally, without anyone's permission, mattered directly to the largest thing there is. A country that tells its people that story enough times, in enough fields and city missions and converted horse stables, should not be surprised when those same people eventually turn around and ask the exact same question about the kings, presidents, and institutions who claim authority over everything else in their lives. That is the fire Cane Ridge could never quite explain to the horrified onlookers who happened to witness it. It is, in one form or another, still burning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone.